year PhD student currently. I took my RQE in November 2020. So it's been more than a year, and I was the first batch who took the RQE, so things have changed a little after that. But nevertheless, I hope you might learn from some of my experiences.
Thanks, Anmol.
So I'm John. I'm on the grad council. So I took it a semester, or I guess 2 semesters ago. Not last semester, the semester before that. I do control systems is my sort of area, and I'm a second year grad student.
Thanks, John.
Hi everyone, I am Mohammad Nawaz Rabbani. So I have taken the RQE in the last semester. That means the fall 2021 at the November, and so I think I am the very recent here to share my experience with you.
Thanks, Mohammed. So yes, we have a wide range of experience, which is fantastic. One thing I'll say ahead of time, as you start thinking about questions and we move into the discussion, if you have specific questions about when do I need to submit a form or what's the exact timeline dates for this, those questions we can kind of give you a general answer, but those are best directed towards Kelly if you have a very specific detail in terms of deadlines or things. So I guess the first question that we'll just kind of start the discussion with, what did you do when you received your papers? How did you go about kind of just preparing in general for the RQE? Where did you start and what did you find most helpful? And this is open to everyone, so the three of you go first.
Yeah. So I mean, first thing I printed out the papers because I don't like reading on screen, so I printed them out and I read them, but I didn't read them I didn't read them all that thoroughly. I wasn't trying to understand everything in the paper. I was more trying to get a sense of what they talked about because you're going to read these papers, many times. So I was getting a sense of what they talked about, and then I I came in with a master's, so I took it in my second semester, uh, which I felt gave me a little less background than someone who maybe takes it later would have. And so I had some good background on some of the stuff, but not as much on other stuff. So I had to go and start looking at just sort of general background for some of the things I was doing.
Okay, in my case, I have two paper assigned in the last semester. I think previously it was 4 paper, but from the last from the last 2 semester, it is 2 paper, and I think in this semester also they assigned 2 papers. So at first, one of the paper was very much related to my research, but one is not so much related. But in higher level, there are some relation with my research. So at first, what I have done is I have to find a connection between these 2 papers, and also I have a quick scan of these papers, and then I decided to I sorted out what are the basic things I should cover. So these are the first things I have arranged in my mind when I received those papers.
So me as well, like John and Mohammed shared, f- uh, in contrast to their experience, I had 4 papers because I was the first one who took it, first batch of students. Nevertheless, as what they did, I took a printout of the papers. First, I roughly went through all of them to see what looks familiar and what does not look familiar, at least on a high level, like for instance, the topics. And I found out that two papers were quite familiar, and the other two papers were a little bit different, quite different from what I was doing at that point of time for research. So, uh, what I did is that I tried to spend more time on the two papers which I didn't have a background on, so that if they require a little bit more reading outside to understand the terms and notations, I can go through maybe a book or some videos on YouTube, or any sort of lectures where I could get familiar with the terms. And then for the other two papers, as I mentioned, that it looked like I had some decent understanding of what's going on. I spent comparatively less time on those two papers. And in my case, since there was no instruction given to us as to, I mean, the only instruction was that you have to present it in a 5-page report and you have to give a presentation, but nothing of this sort was mentioned that you have to connect the four papers or you don't have to connect or something of that sort. So I took it as an assumption that you are supposed to say connect the four papers. So throughout that 1 month, I was trying to develop some sort of a narration where I could connect them in proper context uh, and write my report accordingly. Also, I thought that getting started on your report and having a high level idea of which topics go where, since I had four papers, so that might have been a little bit more challenging because all papers were pretty long and summarizing them in 5 pages was a little bit tougher. But now that you guys have two papers, I'm assuming that's not a big challenge. But I guess as
Yeah,
long as you can connect them, it was fine.
yeah, I mean with 2 pages it was still kind of I was still kind of like I easily could have written 6 pages. I was able to get it, under 5, but you must have had a really hard time.
Right. So that's why I just focused on the high level ideas uh, in in my report as well as presentation. You cannot make the presentation too long either. But at the same time, if someone has a question, so in the interview, eventually they will ask you. So that was my whole process of going through when I was given the papers.
Yeah, I thought your note about watching YouTube videos was a really good one because I initially didn't do that. Like I wanted to get more, complex stuff. So I was starting with like textbooks and other papers about this stuff, but that's kind of trying to run before you can walk, right? And so I eventually ended up starting, watching YouTube videos on some of the topics. And I wish I had done that sooner because I learned a lot more. And then when I went back to the papers and the more formal sources, that I had a much better, like I had a basis, and then I got a better understanding from them then.
Right. Actually, one good thing about the pandemic was that a lot of instructors on different colleges were now actually uploading a lot of their content for free online. So you might just stumble upon something which is very relevant to your field, uh, and they are pretty good as well. So yeah, I guess it's good to have a search on YouTube if something seems unfamiliar, and rather than spending a lot of time on searching on textbooks and research papers just to get a high level idea. Of course, you have to be specific, so maybe eventually you would have to refer to other papers, but it might help you if you see if you get a high level overview pretty, at least in your first week of when you are given the papers, and then you can be slowly get into the specifics.
Yes, another important thing I realized that they actually want us to not only only focus on the specific details of that two papers what have been assigned, rather than they actually want us to cover the broad area of that research field, particular research field. So in that case, I think one thing helped me a lot is the related works or related papers have been referenced at the introduction section of those papers. And from that, I actually started to sort it out what are the problems of those papers in those papers actually addressed, and to cover the broad research area, I actually looked around those related papers. And I make a short list of those papers to read so that I can summarize the broad research area in that case.
All excellent points, and trying to use the pandemic to your advantage in that sense of the lectures is actually a really good point, and there's more content available. So you, several of you, I think all of you, kind of touched on how you went about organizing your paper and trying to kind of piece together in a logical way. I don't know if the three of you want to talk briefly about that, and we actually have a question in the chat box as well to add on to it. Were your papers recently published or something old?
Yes, in my case, one of the paper was from 2017 and another is very recent, in the 2021 actually.
Well, both of my papers were relatively recent as well. I forget exactly, but late 20 teens.
Okay, so in my case, I think I have to check, but it was somewhere around 2014 to 2020, somewhere in that range. But yeah, not earlier, not before 2014. The oldest paper was 2014, I guess.
Yes, oh, we got another question in the chat box. What if your paper is a survey paper on different works in a particular field? Do you mean the paper? So you have to submit a paper, right? Correct me.
Yeah.
Were any of the papers that you preliminarily submitted actually chosen for you as your articles?
No. So is the question that whatever papers I gave to the committee, was that given to me back?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. Chibukem, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Do you want, if you want to unmute and ask your question, that's easier. Clarify.
So I'll try to answer as I understand the question, which is so one of my papers wasn't exactly a survey paper, but it was a sort of comparative paper that was a little like a survey paper, and what I did was I forget if it was Mohammed or Anmol who said, you want to find kind of a narrative. And so in that I was trying to find basically a narrative, which is like, what is this a survey of? And in mine, it was like different approaches to nonlinear optimization problems. And so I sort of focused on it from that perspective. So I think you can still sort of find a narrative and organize the papers that way. I don't know if anyone else had a survey paper sort of assigned to them.
Now, in my case, both of those papers were solved some problems, have solved some problems. So those are not so any survey papers.
Yeah, same in my case, like all four papers solved some specific problem, but the overall space of problems was somewhat similar, you could say. I mean, at least the application was similar. The techniques were different.
Yeah, and so then you talked about like because in my paper it was maybe somewhat similar in that it had different approaches to a nonlinear optimization problem. And so I talked about sort of the strengths and weaknesses or the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches to sort of have a narrative about like what you're talking about. Did you do something similar to that?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, can I ask a question? So, yeah, about survey paper, I actually get one this semester, and what I want to ask is that so since they are survey paper, and wouldn't that be that the summarization of that paper will kind of just like that paper? Because if you're just getting a bunch of paper that solving problems, then you can summarize how they work. But if that's a survey paper, which means that you will eventually writing something similar to that, and would that be a problem, or we just like, yeah?
I don't think so. So as I understand it, they're looking for you to kind of, you're demonstrating an understanding, but you're not presenting like new novel research, right? Like, or at least I didn't, and I don't think anybody else did. So it's not like a thesis, but it's maybe like you're trying to demonstrate that you have the skills that you'll ultimately need to write a thesis, if that makes sense. I don't know what other people's opinion on that is, but mine did end up kind of like a survey paper, yes.
I would say that think of yourself as a reviewer of that paper. So, for instance, suppose that paper was submitted to you and you are a reviewer of it. You want to critique it and bring out the advantages and disadvantages of it, and if possible, I mean, it's good at least. It'll be even better if you could. Of course, you don't have to do any simulations, but on a high level, if there is something which comes to your mind that, okay, doing it a certain way might benefit over this particular method, that should also work, I guess.
Yes, I have an idea about survey papers, although I did not receive any survey papers in my RQE, but I think survey papers cover a lot of topics or lot of techniques in a single paper. So, but all of them will be high level. But to demonstrate, as John says, that the main test is whether you have to demonstrate that you have the understanding. So you can go details of those some key topics what have been covered in the survey papers and go some details in your case, like writing some equations, 2 or 3 equations to cover 2 or 3 techniques which are very important in that particular research field. So it will not be like summarizing the research field, and it will be similar like the survey paper what have been assigned to you. Other than you, if you can, in that case, you can go some details in some key techniques of that particular research field, because survey papers actually cover a lot of details or a lot of variations of techniques. So you can go some important techniques to demonstrate your understanding in that case, I think.
Yeah, and I think Mohammed kind of reminded me of something that came up in our RQE event last semester, is that I think they're really looking for you, to summarize the techniques, but also summarize them with relation to your specific research. So if like you had to write something and sort of explain what you're researching, right? So if one of those techniques is going to be better for your research, that's a really good thing that you can point out, or you can analyze how those different techniques might be applicable to your research or what strengths and weaknesses they have. So you can still do something kind of new or novel that way in terms of you're adding how it affects your research.
Thank you so much. So I got another questions, if I may. Is that
Absolutely.
so? Well, there's another requirement by the departments that you should show the future research directions. And could you guys elaborate how you guys do that? Yeah, that's my questions.
Right. So I think that can be a fairly vague or you don't need to have a fully formed version of that. So I tried to do something like that where you know, one of the things my papers talked about was reinforcement learning. And one of the things I remember um, talking about was instead of using reinforcement learning to try and find an optimal solution, could you use reinforcement learning to try and find uncontrollable subspaces in a problem, which may not mean much if you don't have a control background, but like it was a very conceptual idea. It wasn't like, here, I know how to do this. It was you know, there are some similarities to this and this. Could you use this for what I'm trying to do? If that made sense.
Yes, I think also future research direction is not, I think, necessary, but it will be better if you can add some future research directions in both of those techniques or both of those related to both of these papers. But I think when you will go to the, of course, you will not write all the details in your summary report, but you will go through the details of those papers for your understanding, so that you can answer properly in your presentation when the professors ask you the questions. But so when you go to the details, I think back of the mind you can think about what further can be done and what further can be done several times, and I think you will find some idea. Maybe it will not be feasible or not sure, but you can say some ideas how you can improve the results or do better. Just some high level ideas, one, two or three points of high level ideas. That's enough, I think, for the future, to cover the future research direction requirement.
Yeah, so I agree with the other two people who just mentioned about some of the ideas, but here I would bring in this aspect as well, that you are either in your second semester or your third semester, so you have been exposed to some amount of research which you are doing yourself on a problem which you are working on. Of course, it might not be similar, or I mean, it won't be like drastically different than the papers you got. So I would say take that to your advantage. If you try to find, like, just try to find some connection. If you could try to find some connection between what you have been working on and these papers, that can also be a good idea to extend. Like, you could just borrow that idea from maybe what you're already working on, and if it is established, then that is even better. But even if it's in your initial stages, I think you don't need to worry. Having a high level idea is sort of enough.
Okay, thank you.
My understanding from what you basically gave two ideas from the research direction. Either you can like relate it to what you're doing if you're already doing something, and that would be nice, or you could like propose something that you could expand from the papers themselves. Is that about it?
Yes, either way is enough, I think. Yeah, yes, you can also add some relations or connections, or if some of those papers or some of the ideas you can use in your research, and if you can say it in your report or in your presentation, that is also a plus point, I think. You can do in both of these ways, or you can keep both of these concept in your report, or if you don't even find any connections between direct connections or direct use of the techniques or concept of that paper in your research, that's fine. Then you can discuss about the further improvement of that particular paper, not finding relation between those papers. So you can add both of these in your report. But after all, you have to make 5-page reports. So you have to whatever you write, you have to write it in a summary in 5 page.
I would also add here that, like, of course, it'll be good, like, depending on it will actually this part would actually differ from person to person in various ways, because maybe there'll be few people who might not have received similar papers, or when I say similar, maybe you might not be very well acquainted with what's there in the paper. But if that's the case, like, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, maybe you might know a lot about what's going on in those papers already. So if that's the case, I would also encourage that. So for instance, you are already working for 2 or 3 semesters. So if there is any sort of simulations which you could quickly do, I mean, by quickly, I mean if you could just maybe spend a few hours, and you think it is possible to come up with some, illustrate those ideas in the form of some preliminary simulations, that will also be fine. Of course, that will depend on your research, as I agree that maybe for people who do hardware research, this is not even possible. But say for people who are doing some sort of ML or some sort of simulation based work, it might also it might make sense, and uh, it might show your initiative as well. So of course, it's depending on your kind of work. But if it is inclined towards some simulation, then uh, this sort of, like, take it to your advantage. Don't hesitate in doing any sort of additional work. They will always appreciate it. Even if you don't add it in your report because you think you're running out of space, add it to the presentation, and you could show your ideas in the presentation. I'm sure they will probably ask some questions, or if not, then at least appreciate it.
These are great questions coming in, and some of these topics, right? The three of you have been mentioning, you only have 5 pages. So were there things that, how did you balance expanding on things in your presentation versus what you put in the paper, and how did you kind of organize both of those to make sure you strengthened your argument but used your space wisely?
I'm not gonna lie, I played around with the margins of my paper before submitting it. that you can squeeze a lot more into a paper by adjusting the margins and font size.
What I have done, yes.
Yeah, go ahead, no problem.
Yes, please. Okay. So what I have done is that after reading those papers 2 or 3 times, and even reading some related papers, what I have done at first, I have developed a theme of my report, that or design a structure of my report, and then I worked around based on the structure like that. There are some required sections in your report, maybe introduction, then conclusion, and abstract. So you can think how you can write your introduction first, and then also how you will cover the broad research area in the other sections. So what I have done is that at the first section, introduction section, I discussed one of the related works of one of the paper, and then other, and then ending the introduction section by connecting them. And then in the next section, I actually had 2 subsection. One of the subsection was covering the other research area, and then the other subsection is covering the specific details of that particular paper. Similarly, the third section also, I oriented the structure in a similar way for the other paper. And then the fourth section, I have provided some future research directions. And in the conclusions, I have also looked to find some other papers which actually criticize the results of that particular 2 papers, because one of the papers was very popular paper in that research field, but there are some very recent papers I found that which actually criticize the result or find some flaws of that particular paper. So I also mentioned that in the conclusion. So that was my structure of the report or report. But then when I was preparing for my presentation, I actually exactly followed the structure of my report in the presentation. So it was easy for me. So I felt that if you can make the structure very concrete in your report, then it is very easy to make the presentation slides in similar way.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree with Mohammed that like the way he told, like I'll say work more on your report, and on your in the last week probably making a presentation would eventually be not very tough once you've worked quite a lot on your report, on the structure, on the high level details. But two things that I would like to add is that first, Mohammed brought a very good point that if there is a given paper which is say published, which is say given to you, you could look at different literature which criticize this paper to uh, it could help you give some points, right? Maybe something you've missed when you read it, and the other literature actually points that out. So that will actually help you uh, into getting into, say, some details which you maybe missed when you read it or you didn't figure it out. And second thing would be that, so in my case, since I had four papers, I had a section for each of those papers. So I had four sections. Of course, I did not go into too many details in the report. Uh, so I just focused on the high level details in the report, and in the presentation, you cannot have a very long presentation as well. You have a time constraint. So what I did is that if there was anything, say, sophisticated in some particular paper, I relegated that to the appendix section of my presentation, not the report, because report, I think it's just 5 pages. You cannot have a lot of appendix, I guess. And by that, you're not showing it to the presenter when you're presenting it, but say in your Q&A, if there is anything maybe you've already written there, you want to show it, that can be one way to go. Or I'm assuming that you guys would be, I think your presentation will be in person. So for my case, I'm not sure whether it's in person or online. In my case, it was online, so I had a camera where I had to show what I'm writing. So I think that's why I had that. I I prepared a section in the presentation which I didn't show immediately, but in case I needed something which I wanted to show, I also just had it in the PPT just in case.
yeah, I think that's a very good question. I actually got a question about some things I wish I didn't do that, but I wish I had created a sort of appendix to the presentation because I got a couple of questions. It would have been helpful to have some of the equations that I didn't put in the presentation, but it would have been helpful to have in the appendix.
Also, just to add one more point, that I tried to make my presentation and report a little different in the sense that I didn't want to be redundant. So I'm assuming your reviewers or whoever is taking your RQE will spend some time, at least I'm assuming 1 day on your report. So I tried to keep them a little bit different so that they don't just see the same thing which they saw in the report. And just because a given paper, I am assuming it'll be at least 5 pages. So I'm sure you will be able to uh, come up with things where you can. So that's why I'm saying spend a lot of time on your report. Once you know all those specific details which are going in a paper, in your presentation, okay, that these are the details. Maybe this is the high level. You could sort of distribute it in such a way so that when you present both the report and the presentation, it has a complete work in some sense.
We do have a question in the chat that asks if there's any recommended format for the report.
So in my case, as I mentioned, I had multiple sections, one section for each paper, but at the same time, and I used the introduction section to connect the two papers, an abstract, a conclusion, and last section was future directions. So I used future directions and the introduction to connect the papers and to extend what I was working on using these papers.
I think they have stated some form, one of the format, I think, of the report in the email. I think, in my case, I think I was sure that they specified that how the format will be structured, or let's say they said that the report must have an introduction, must have an abstract, an introduction, then the detail section, and then conclusion. Uh, these are the sections they specified in email that should be included in the report.
I'm glad you got that because I guess they're adding more specifications. When I did it, there was not, and I assume animal is similar.
Yes.
I didn't really get those details. I did that. I put all those things in, but it was not specified to do it that way.
So check your email. If you, some of you are probably taking the exam this semester. If you're here just to, prepare ahead of time, a lot more of the specific details about, how many weeks you have to do the paper and what's required, all of that will be sent to you by Kelly when your semester arrives.
But I would also add that I don't think it's a bad idea to cross-check with your examiners to see whether you are at least doing what they expect in the sense of a recommended format. Of course, you cannot ask details, but you can at least say that is there any particular format which you want in case it is not mentioned to you in the email. So I don't think that might be a fair idea, I guess.
Yeah. So at least when I did it, there was a fair bit of flexibility. Like I remember asking, do our references count towards the 5 pages? And the answer I got was basically, what does your committee say? So it I think could depend a lot, but it sounds like it's getting maybe more formalized if Mohammed's getting a little more written
Yes,
structure.
but now they actually specify that the 5 page without reference, they specify it in the email.
Oh yeah, that
Now
was
they are
good to
very
hear.
organized.
Yeah, that's good.
So I think the conversation was starting to kind of head in the direction of what was the presentation like? What types of questions were you asked? Were you asked specifically about your research during your actual presentation portion? Kind of a 3-in-1, but basically, how did it go?
Yeah, so the presentation I got I didn't get questions about like how do you apply this to your research, which I know from previous events people have gotten questions like that, a lot of questions like that, but I had also put, a section of my presentation was explicitly talking about that. So that may have been why I didn't get those questions. And so mostly I got things that were clarifying um, the things I said in the presentation. I got 1 or 2 more technical questions, one of which I really should have been expecting because one of my professors does all his work is on gradient descent and machine learning, and he asks some pretty technical questions on gradient descent and machine learning that I did not do particularly well on. because I wasn't expecting. I guess I had the impression that it wouldn't be technical questions, and mostly they weren't. But he gave me a couple technical questions that I did not do particularly well on. But mostly it was questions about the content and clarifying what you said.
Yes, another thing I have done before my presentation is that I practiced it several times, 5 or 6 times at least. So if you practice more the presentation, I think it will give you a flow in the main presentation. I think it helped me a lot. And after the presentation, the questions, I have sorted out that there were two types of questions. Some of the questions were basic questions. They actually asked me those questions to test my understanding and knowledge in the with the basics of that particular research area. And then there are other types of questions which actually with some future research directions type questions, that whether it can be possible to extend, whether it that can be done, or like these types of questions. And in that case, they were also not sure that whether it is not possible or not, but they actually tested me how I actually think about those possibilities. So I think these are the other types of questions they ask.
Yeah, in my case, I would say that there were again different kind of questions depending on uh, which examiner had given me that paper. But to summarize, I would say that my questions were more on the sides of, like, I would say they were more technical. So, for instance, if a particular paper had some assumption, why do you think they took this assumption? So, of course, generally papers take some assumptions that that is an artifact of the method they use. So, for instance, if you use some algorithm A, uh, that might have an inherent assumption that you have to, if you don't take this assumption, you might not be able to even apply that algorithm. So you should know these kind of things, like little details where uh, maybe those assumptions are very well known, maybe that assumptions are not very well known in some fields. So I would say that is an important aspect. Um, the other ones I would say were more focused, like they had clarifying questions, they had uh, like some sort of like hypothetical questions as well, uh, like if this were to be done differently, do you think there is any, like, open-ended questions, like if this were to be done this way, or because they have done it this way, do you think there is any other good method to address this? So if there is, say, a follow-up paper which you have read that which addresses such a concern, that might help you. Other than that, of course, that particular follow-up paper might also just address one particular concern. So you could, if there are any other concerns you think, you can state that uh, to the examiners as well. So I would say, like, the critique. So of course, this might not be applicable to survey papers, but for papers which have like specific techniques, they might have some certain assumptions. Uh, be well known with what kind of assumptions are they taking. Sometimes the assumptions come from the fact that that problem is, if you don't take that assumption, then the problem is computationally infeasible or so on.
John had mentioned in prior RQE events, so one we had last semester, there was a student that was asked quite a lot of questions about the research that they were doing. They were more on like the fabrication, device design end. So it could be too, depending on what your research area is. And also, something to add is that if you are talking to people who maybe took the exam a couple of semesters ago, there was an extended delay because of COVID where they actually pushed back the exams by a semester. So there was also just more time to do research. So the more semesters you have behind you, obviously, the more questions they could ask. Now it's back to the standard, 2 semesters if you have a master, or after your first semester if you have a master's, and 2 if you have your bachelor's. So coming in. So just keep that in mind if you're talking to other people who have taken the exam and they were asked a lot of research questions. That could be part of the contributing cause. So. If you have any, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Oh, so I actually have a question, but if you want to ask one, Lauren, or if particularly if anyone else in the audience has a question, I'd much rather do that.
All I was gonna say is if anyone had questions. So if you got a question, or if someone in the audience does.
Yeah, I do have a question. You guys keep talking about the narrative. Like, there's one thing I don't particularly get that much is that you're given 2 research papers, or 4 before, but now 2. And from more or less what I got from what you said, it was like half of them were more aligned to your research, to your field, and one was a bit off, like still related, but not something you've been focusing on, so to say. But I'd like to ask, how do you guys like do this narrative? Do you guys just follow just follow the field and try to like do a explanation over the field and then fit those 2 papers in? Or did you guys like focus on session to just talk about one paper? Like let's say for example, like your research area is control. You do like an intro on control where you do some like you reveal the state of art or something, then you focus on one of the papers on your second section, like you go deep into that one, and then on this another section you go deep into that other one. But or do they have to like sort of correlate into a sort of sequence, if that makes sense? I'm not sure if I'm being too clear here.
So I think I understand what you're saying, and maybe I mean maybe another word for narrative you could use is theme. So like in mine, I had one paper that was sort of a survey paper that was comparing sort of machine learning techniques and more traditional control techniques in the optimal control problem. And then the other one was specifically on this result in a sort of gradient descent, well, policy optimization through gradient descent, which is, so all of those are just sort of different approaches to a nonlinear optimal control problem. And so I had this sort of theme of like, okay, I'm looking at different ways to do a nonlinear optimal control problem. Uh, and so for me, I guess maybe theme would fit with what I was doing better. But I broke all of those apart and talked about, the different methods and approaches, and then talked about ways you could expand on that. So in what I did, narrative is maybe not the right word, but you need something to give it a sort of organizational structure, right? And so that's kind of what I was trying to do. It doesn't have to be like a story.
You also need to like include those papers, but you don't need to like straight out laser focus on that, so to say. Like in the
Well,
sense that you can take the general techniques and like I'm trying to think of like a structure if you're given things that are like a bit away from each other.
well, so I don't I don't know exactly, but so I guess ultimately, right, you get your papers are assigned based off something you submit, right? Which is, a description of the type of thing you're working on for your research, and then a couple of suggested papers. So, like, hopefully your papers will both have some relationship to that, if nothing else, right? And
Okay.
I don't know what that would be, but they're not like totally random, right?
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense.
Oh, okay. Because you're not doing it this semester, right? You're just trying to
Yeah,
be you're just
yeah,
trying to be
I'm trying to
prepared.
future proof. I'm
Sure.
doing the next semester.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So so I just saw a question in the chat box. Is it possible that we can have a copy of your reports to get more intuition on writing them? I have no objection. My I might need to. Lauren, I don't know if you know would
It
like
was it's kind of something we had talked about when the RQE was first introduced. Like, can you share your papers and what's the likelihood of somebody getting the same papers as you? Probably not high. I don't know that we ever came to a definitive yes or no. So that's probably something, if you're comfortable with, but certainly not required to, and I think we can follow up on that.
Yeah, I just don't want to like get anybody. I don't know how independent. Like I don't want to get anybody accused of plagiarism or get in trouble with that, or not even plagiarism. Just yeah, I might want to yeah
You have
ask
to
a
figure
question.
out so that you're not getting any repercussions from it. So that's a
Yeah.
good question, and we will get back to you on that.
So if no one else has a question, I'll ask one for a little bit. Which is a couple of times, things have come up, or like it was mentioned earlier. I, I forget if it was Mohammed or Anmol who said they watched YouTube videos, and I ended up doing that, and I regretted not doing it sooner. So I was curious if there were other things you had that were sort of lessons learned, or sort of warnings that you can tell people, like don't do this. Uh, like for me also, I had a big gap between when the report was due and when my presentation was, and I was sick of looking at it. So I submitted the report and then I didn't look at it for like a week. And coming back and trying to do that report, it made it, way harder because I hadn't looked at it at all for a week and I had forgotten everything. So I was curious if you had other things like that obviously you're here, it worked out, you did well. But if there were things that you did that you thought you could save someone from going down a wrong path.
I followed the fully orthodox way actually, reading related papers or related materials, not seeing any YouTube videos or like that. One of the technique I think anyone can use is that if some of the papers are from the conference, I think you can find the talk of that particular paper by the particular author in that conference. You can search and find the talk what they have given in that conference, because right now, if that conference paper is very recent, then right now due to the COVID, all of those conferences are virtual. So they actually upload the videos of that by the particular author. So if you can hear his talk or her talk, it will help you a lot, I think, because sometimes you can think about something, some technicalities in a different way, but if you can hear from the particular author, it will help you to go in the right direction, and it will help you to think in the right directions for that particular technique they introduced in the paper.
Something that I learned from my qualifying exam, although it was a different format, but in the question section, right, the idea is similar. I think the biggest thing is to just, you're already in the situation, you've prepared your paper, you've done your presentation, you've done all that you can do to prep ahead of time. Make sure you take a minute to just like calm your mind and don't panic, because I think sometimes if you get answered a question that maybe catches you off guard, it's easy to go into the spin of like, oh, I don't even know how to start answering it. Just take the basic building blocks of what you've learned throughout your preparation and try your best to make, a conclusion that's good. I think, John, you might have said it, or maybe it was Muhammad, but you're not, you might be proposing something in future work and you don't fully know if it's going to work or not. That at least as long as you're answering the question and trying your best to get to that point. I think somebody last semester said they had proposed something and they actually realized it wouldn't work. And that was a conversation they had. So I think just keeping, your composure and trying to answer as best as you can and making sure you answer every question as fully as you can would be the advice I have.
Yeah. On that note, I think also like a partial answer is better than no answer. And so if you can give like, or if you can make an assumption and answer the problem, or if you can, give something, and also because this has come up in previous RQEs, they don't expect perfection in terms of answering the questions. Like I said, there was a line of questions I know I did very poorly on. I think it's about 50%. You need to be doing answering the questions well, but I don't know that there's a hard number, but you don't have to be perfect, and just not being stressed and going into it just like you've prepared. Don't stress out. You don't have to be perfect.
Does anybody have any other questions about anything we've talked about? Oh, Sergio, you unmuted. I didn't know if if you wanted to say something. Go for it.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add on top of that. So Lauren and I don't know if anyone else in the call, Burak, we did a different exam, but I completely subscribe to that last part of the discussion. So if there's something they ask and you don't know, it's completely fine if you just say no, I don't know that. So don't feel bad about it. They, as John said, so they are not expecting perfection, but it's completely fine to not know all the details about something. So if you just know the high level idea, then go with it, and then admit that there is something that you don't know. That I mean, all of us, we are here to learn new things every day to get better, and you are not expected to be an expert by the time on every single topic of your related to the papers that you were assigned. So you're not supposed to be an expert by the moment you're doing the qualifiers, like on a broad area of knowledge. So it's completely fine if you just say, I don't know, and that, in my personal opinion, that speaks really highly of yourself, because at this level, I trust the people who say that they don't know something. I trust them a little bit more than the people who don't admit when they don't know about a topic. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add. Those are my 2 cents. Hello, everyone. Is anyone here still?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yes.
I I
Yeah.
very, yeah, I very much agree. Yeah.
Okay, there was this awkward silence for a bit.
Oh
So
yeah. Sorry. Sorry.
Okay.
All right, I think what I'll do, I will stop the recording. And so if anybody has